The 4020 at harvest, that thing hasn't turned a wheel in 20 years, old man. You're embarrassing yourself. Roy Lester said it loud enough that 3 men near the grain elevator heard it. He was standing beside his truck, new dealer plated, the kind of clean that never sees a field, and he was looking at Norm Schulte's 1968 John Deere 4020, the way a man looks at a stray dog that has wandered into a formal dinner. Dismissive, certain, not even curious enough to be cruel on purpose. Norm didn't answer. He just climbed up into the seat, set his hands on the wheel, and turned the key. The 4020 lit on the second crank. That was the 3rd week of October, outside the Harlan County Co-op in central Kansas, and by sundown, everyone within 6 miles would know what that tractor had done that day. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Good stories earn their endings. Let's go back to where this one started, which is not with the tractor, and not with Roy Lester, but with a woman named June Hartley and a wheat field that was about to break her. Part 1. The field in trouble. June Hartley was 54 years old and had been farming alone for 2 years. Her husband Dale had died of a heart attack in the cab of a combine in late August of the year before last, the cruelest kind of death for a farmer, taken by the very work he loved, right at the moment the work demanded everything. She had buried him in the small cemetery east of the county road and then gone back to the field, because there was nothing else to do, and because Dale would have said the same. She farmed 680 acres of winter wheat east of Pratt, Kansas. The land was flat and dark and good, the kind of ground that forgives most mistakes if you catch them early. Dale had left her the farm debt-free, which was a miracle in itself. 30 years of careful choices, no banker ever getting the better of him. What he hadn't left her was a deep bench of equipment. They had run lean, the 2 of them, because lean meant no payments and no payments meant you survived the bad years. The harvest of the year that matters here was coming off well. Yields were running better than county average, which June had learned to take as a quiet grace. She had hired 2 local boys to run the combine and a grain cart, and she had lined up hauling with the Becker brothers, who had done the job for Dale for 15 seasons. Everything was in place. Then, the rain came. It rained for 4 days straight, in the 2nd week of October. Not the gentle prairie rain that soaks in and raises no alarm, but the heavy, sheeting kind that fills every low spot and turns worked ground to paste. June's east quarter, which should have been the last section to cut, sat under 2 inches of standing water for most of those 4 days. When the rain stopped, the field dried slowly. The wheat, already late in standing, began to lodge. A quarter mile of it went flat to the ground in a single wet night. She called her combine operator, Cal Devins, and he told her plainly the machine could not go into standing water that deep. His combine was a new model, 3 years old, and had electronics under the platform that would not survive submersion. He was sorry. He meant it, but he was not willing to kill a $380,000 machine for 170 acres of wheat, even for a widow he respected. She called 2 other custom cutters. Same answer. She called the co-op, just to think out loud. And that was how she ended up talking to Roy Lester. Roy Lester was the equipment manager at Harlan County Farm Supply, which shared a parking lot with the co-op elevator and did good business selling new machinery to the farmers who brought their grain in. He was 41 years old, had grown up in Wichita, and had come to the county 8 years ago when the dealership was bought by a regional chain. He knew equipment in the way of catalogs and spec sheets. He had never farmed. He listened to June explain her situation, and then he offered to sell her a new tractor, a large frame utility model that he said could handle wet field conditions. The price was $187,000. He could have it delivered in 3 days. June thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. The yellow curtains Dale had never wanted to change, the cast iron pan on the back burner, the county fair ribbons tacked along the top of the window. 2 years was not long enough to make her feel like it was only hers. She was still living in the life they had built together, and every decision she made inside this house felt like a conversation with a man who was no longer there to answer. She picked up the phone again and called Norm Schulte. Part 2. Norman Earl Schulte was 70 years old and had retired from active farming 4 years earlier, when his knees made it clear they were not going to let him climb in and out of a cab 30 times a day anymore. He had leased his ground to a neighbor boy named Patterson, kept his shop, kept his tools, and kept his 1968 John Deere 4020, which he had bought used in 1979 and rebuilt twice since then. The 4020 was not a complicated machine. It was a 91 horsepower 2-cylinder diesel, some would say 4-cylinder, and they would be splitting a technical hair that Norm had no patience for, in a frame that weighed just under 8,000 pounds. It had no electronics. It had no screens. It had a throttle and a clutch and a transmission with 8 forward gears, and it had hydraulics driven by a gear pump that could push 8 gallons a minute at 2,500 psi. The hydraulic system had nothing to do with the electronics because there were no electronics. If you drove it into standing water up to the axle caps, the engine would keep running and the pump would keep pumping and the wheels would keep turning, because none of the parts that mattered were afraid of water. Norm had kept it because he loved it. He had not expected it to be useful again. He listened to June explain the situation. He asked 3 questions. How deep is the standing water? Roughly, how flat is the lodged wheat? And is your grain cart in working order? She answered, maybe 4 to 6 inches in the worst spots. Very flat, a full section went down in the night. And yes, the grain cart was fine. It was just sitting. Norm said, I'll be there at 6 tomorrow morning. I'm not promising anything, but let me look at it. He drove the 4020 over on his lowboy the following morning, which was a Tuesday, because a man does not drive a restored 1968 tractor 12 miles on a state highway unless he has made his peace with traffic. He arrived in June's yard at 6:10, with the sky still gray in the east and the smell of wet ground so strong it was almost a color. June was standing by the shop door with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word, and they stood together looking at the field. The east quarter was a sorry sight. The lodged wheat lay in long diagonal swaths where the wind had pressed it, and the low spots in the field gleamed with standing water. You could see from the road that any modern platform would catch the crop wrong, the header designed to cut wheat standing upright, not flat to the mud. Norm finished his coffee. He set the cup on the lowboy fender. He said, drive me around the edge of it. They drove June's pickup along the field road for a quarter mile, and Norm looked at the low spots and the angles of the lodging and the way the water was sitting. He got out twice and walked into the field in his rubber boots and dug at the ground with his heel to see how deep the soft layer went. When they got back to the shop, he said, I can run the grain cart. Your boys can run the combine. They'll just need to keep the head down low and cut slow. The 4020 can get through those wet spots because it doesn't have anything to lose. The grain cart's rubber-tired and light enough empty. We go 1 load at a time. I pull away from the combine every time it's full, dump at the elevator end, come back. Repeat until it's done. June looked at him. How many loads do we think? Norm did the math in his head. At 170 acres and the yield you're describing, maybe 18, 19 trips. Depends on what the combine can actually cut before it plugs. All right, she said. One thing, Norm said. I'd like to do this without Roy Lester finding out until it's over. June raised an eyebrow. He came by last month when I was loading the 4020 onto the lowboy for the county fair. Told me the tractor was a liability and I ought to sell it for parts before someone got hurt on it. Said the fair was for farmers, not collectors. June's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. All right, she said again. Let's get to it. Part 3. The first runs they started at 7:30 when the combine boys arrived. Cal's replacement, a young man named Travis Burke, who was calm and capable and willing to listen, and his brother Aaron on the grain cart. Norm explained the plan. Travis had never cut lodged wheat in wet ground with a 1968 tractor pulling the cart, but he was 26 years old and had enough sense to know that the man explaining the plan had been doing this for 50 years. The first pass was slow. Travis brought the header down as low as it would go and crept across the first wet stretch at little more than walking speed, watching the crop feed into the platform. It struggled in the lodged sections. You could hear the machine working harder, the engine note dropping, but it didn't plug. The 4020 sat at the end of the row with the grain cart behind it, Norm at the wheel, watching the combine make its way up the field like a patient animal. When the combine's tank reached capacity, Travis swung toward the grain cart, and Norm eased forward to match him. The auger swung out. Grain fell. The 4020 sat in 4 inches of standing water without complaint. That first load took 45 minutes. Norm hauled it the half-mile to June's grain bin, unloaded, drove back. The 4020's exhaust stack sent up a thin grey plume that the morning air pulled apart almost immediately. The sound of the engine, that particular 2-cylinder note, lower and more deliberate than modern machines, carried across the flat ground in a way that modern tractors do not. A neighbor a mile away later said he heard it and knew something unusual was happening, just from the sound. By noon they had completed 6 loads. Travis was getting better at cutting the lodge sections, learning the angles, learning when to slow and when he could push. The grain was coming off cleaner than June had expected, damaged at the tips from the rain, but the test weight was holding. She took samples every 2 loads and ran them to the elevator, and the numbers were coming back acceptable. Roy Lester was at the elevator when she brought the second sample. He was standing at the scale with 2 other farmers, talking about delivery schedules. He watched June come in and nodded without warmth. "You get that East Quarter cut?" he asked. "Working on it," she said. "Who'd you find to run it?" "A neighbor," she said. He looked at her for a moment, deciding whether to ask more. He decided not to. He went back to his conversation. June drove back to the field. By 3 in the afternoon, they had 10 loads down. Travis had found his rhythm. The combine was handling the conditions better than anyone had expected, mostly because Travis had learned to approach the worst wet spots on a slight angle that let the platform lift the lodged wheat rather than pushing it down. Norm had not gotten the 4020 stuck once. He had gotten it deep. One low spot had come up to the axle caps and the water had run over the step plate, but the machine had never hesitated. It pulled through on its own, straightened up, and kept going. They stopped for 40 minutes at 3:30 to eat the sandwiches June had brought out and to let Travis walk the field ahead for the next section. Norm sat on the 4020 step with a sandwich and a thermos of coffee and looked at what was left. 6 more loads, he said. Maybe 7. Tonight? June asked. If Travis wants to go until dark. The lodge section we've got left is the worst, but we know how to handle it now. He'll be fine. Travis said he wanted to go until dark. They went until dark. Part 4, the last load, the 16th load, came off the field at 7:40 in the evening. The light had gone orange and then amber and then gone almost entirely, and Travis was running on the combine's work lights, which threw a white cone across the cut wheat ahead of him. The 4020's headlights, original seal beams, replaced 3 years ago with new old stock units Norm had found at an estate sale, threw 2 smaller cones ahead of the grain cart. The last wet spot on the field was a depression maybe 30 yards across, and it was the deepest one they had not yet cut. Travis came into it slow and careful, with the header down. The water came up over the header floor and lapped at the elevator chain housing. The combine engine dropped in pitch and held. Travis did not slow further. He had learned that slowing in a wet spot was the wrong move, that you had to commit and keep moving, and the machine came through trailing a V of dark water behind it like a boat. Norm was already positioned at the field end when the tank hit capacity. He matched up. The auger swung. The grain fell into the cart in the dark. June was standing at the field edge with a flashlight pointed at the ground so as not to blind anyone. When the auger swung back and Travis signaled thumbs up, she let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 6 days. Norm drove the last load to the bin. He drove the 4020 back to the shop yard after, packed it into its spot, and climbed down with care because his knees had had a long day. June was waiting with a glass of iced tea. Travis and Aaron had loaded their gear and said their goodbyes and gone. The yard was quiet. The sky had stars. 16 loads, she said. 16 loads, he said. What do I owe you? He shook his head. Dale helped me put a roof on my machine shed in 2011. He wouldn't take anything for it. Call it square. She didn't argue. Some things you don't argue with. Part 5. Roy Lester at the elevator the following morning. Norm trailered the 4020 to the co-op to pick up a parts order he had placed the week before, belts for his shop compressor. He backed the lowboy into the dealer parking lot at 8:15 and went inside. Roy Lester was there. He was at the counter talking to one of the co-op staff, and he turned when Norm came in. He glanced out the window at the lowboy and the 4020 on it. You take that thing somewhere? He said. June Hartley's, Norm said. We finished her east quarter last night. Roy Lester stared at him. You ran that tractor in her flooded field. It's not complicated machinery, Norm said. Doesn't mind water. She needed a real machine, Lester said. She needed something with the capacity to handle those conditions safely. She needed the field cut, Norm said. It's cut. The co-op staffer, a woman named Deb, who had worked the counter for 11 years, was watching this without expression, which meant she was paying close attention. Roy Lester took a different angle. You know that equipment's not insured for custom work. Wasn't doing custom work, Norm said. I was helping a neighbor. There's a liability issue there. If something had gone wrong, nothing went wrong. You'd have been personally liable, and she'd have had no recourse. Norm collected his parts order from Deb. He signed the receipt. He looked at Roy Lester with the patience of a man who has spent 50 years dealing with the weather and doesn't have much alarm left for other people's opinions. The field's cut, he said. The grain's in the bin. June Hartley's going to make her mortgage payment. Have a good day, Roy. He went back outside and climbed into his truck. He had his hand on the door handle when Roy Lester came out behind him. I'm trying to tell you something, Lester said. That machine is not safe. It is not up to modern standards. You're going to get someone hurt with it. Norm looked at him through the window. He said, very quietly, that machine just did something none of your machines were willing to do. So, I'd be careful about what I call safe. He pulled the door shut and drove home. Part 6, the county fair 3 weeks later, was the Harlan County Equipment and Heritage Fair, which was held in the county fairgrounds the last weekend of October and drew farmers and collectors from 4 counties. It was, as Roy Lester had said the previous month, for farmers, but it was also for the machinery they had kept, and the stories those machines carried, and the understanding that sometimes the old ways hold up in the new world. Norm had entered the 40-20 in the Heritage Tractor class, which he had done for the past 2 years. He didn't do it to win. He did it because the machine deserved to be seen, and because he liked talking to people who knew what they were looking at. June Hartley had told the story. She hadn't intended to make a public thing of it. She was a private woman and had not spent the weeks after harvest making phone calls. But she had told it to her neighbor, who had told it to the Beckers, who had run grain for Dale for 15 seasons, and the Beckers were people who talked. By the day of the fair, most of the county knew the outline. Norm Schulter's old 40-20 had done 16 loads for June Hartley's flooded East Quarter when every modern machine in the county had turned it down. Roy Lester was at the fair. He was there in his professional capacity, staffing a display for Harlan County Farm Supply that featured 2 new utility tractors on the grass, clean and green and enormous, with spec sheets in plastic sleeves on stands beside them. He had been there since 8 in the morning, and business was slow, which it often was at the fair because people came to look at old things and remember, not to buy new things. He watched Norm drive the 40-20 to its spot in the Heritage Row. He watched people stop and talk to Norm. He watched 2 older farmers squat down and look at the engine. He watched a woman take a photograph. He watched a boy about 12 years old sit in the seat while Norm explained the controls. He walked over at 11 o'clock. Norm saw him coming. He did not move away. Nice turnout, Lester said. He meant it as neutral, and it came out that way. Always a good fair, Norm said. Lester looked at the tractor. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how many loads did you end up getting off that field? 16. Lester was quiet again. Then, at what yield? June averaged 42 bushels on the East Quarter. Better than she expected. Lester looked at the machine. Really looked at it. Not the dismissive glance of a few weeks ago, but a longer look. The kind where you are trying to understand something. He looked at the axle housings, which still carried a faint waterline mark where the water had been. He looked at the engine, which Norm kept clean enough that you could see the color of the block. He looked at the seat, cracked along the back edge from 40 years of Kansas sun. I underestimated it, he said finally. Norm didn't say anything, and I was rude about it, Lester said. When I came by your place last month, I was out of line. This was not what Norm had been expecting. He was quiet a moment. Appreciate you saying so, he said. I'm in the business of selling new machines, Lester said. I don't always. I sometimes forget that newer isn't always the answer to everything. He paused. The machine handled it better than anything we had on the lot would have. You knew that. I didn't. Norm looked at the 40-20 beside them. He said, "I'm not against new equipment. You know that. The 4020 is the right tool for some things. Your machines are the right tools for other things. The error is thinking one cancels the other." Lester nodded slowly. June's field needed something that didn't care about water, Norm said. This one didn't care about water. That's all it was. They stood together for a moment looking at the machine. One of Lester's salesmen came across the grass to ask him something about a delivery schedule, and he excused himself and went. Norm watched him go. Deb from the co-op counter was standing nearby. She had been listening from 5 feet away. "First time I've ever seen him say he was wrong about something," she said. "People surprise you," Norm said. "Sometimes," she said. Part 7. June's final numbers. The grain from June Hartley's East Quarter came off at an average test weight of 59.2 pounds per bushel, below the 60-pound benchmark that premium buyers prefer, but within the acceptable range for the elevator contract she had in place. The protein averaged 13.1% across the 16 loads, which was good for the variety and the year. Her yield on the East Quarter averaged 42 bushels per acre on 170 acres, which put her total at 7,140 bushels. At the elevator contract price of $5.87 per bushel, that quarter came out to $41,912. She had been looking at zero 2 weeks earlier. She made her mortgage payment in November. As she had every November for the 12 years she and Dale had farmed the place together, and the 2 years since. She sent Norm a card at Christmas, one of those plain ones with a pine branch on the front, no verse, and wrote inside it in her careful hand, "The field is resting now. So am I. Thank you." He kept the card on the shop bench beside the coffee maker. Part 8. What the 4020 knew. There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't fit on a spec sheet. Roy Lester knew horsepower and hydraulic flow rates and tire load ratings and the depreciation schedules that made new equipment make financial sense on a tax return. He knew those things well, and they were not nothing. They were real, and they mattered, and they helped farmers make decisions every day. But there was something he had not known, and that the 4020 had known for 56 years, that the field does not care about your spec sheet. The field has its own conditions, and sometimes those conditions are not the ones you planned for. And what you need at that moment is not the machine with the most features, but the machine that can do the one thing the moment requires. The 4020 could go through water. It could do this because its designers in 1968 had built it simply enough that water was not its enemy. The hydraulics were sealed. The electrics were minimal. The engine breathed high. The axles were solid. None of this was an accident. It was the accumulated judgment of engineers who knew that farms flooded and fields were imperfect, and that a tool which could only work in ideal conditions was a limited tool. Norm Schulte had kept the tractor because he loved it. And that was true, and also not the whole truth. He had kept it because he had spent 50 years learning what he needed, and the 4020 was one of the things he needed, and he was not going to let someone else's opinion change that calculation. He had rebuilt it twice. He knew every bolt. He knew the sounds it made when it was working hard, and the different sound it made when it was just loafing along. He knew it in the way you know a friend, not from a manual, but from time. That knowledge was worth something. It had been worth $41,912 to June Hartley in round numbers, plus the mortgage payment, plus 2 years of not having to sell. It was worth the look on Roy Lester's face at the fair. It was worth the card on the shop bench. Part 9. Norm at home, he drove the 4020 home from the fair on the lowboy, because 12 miles on a state highway was still 12 miles. He unloaded it in the shop yard in the late afternoon, backed it under the shed roof, and shut it down. He stood there for a moment in the quiet. The shop smelled of oil and old concrete, and the faint sweetness of the diesel exhaust that had settled into the rafters over 40 years. The light came through the west window in long bars and lay across the floor. He put his hand on the engine cover. The metal was warm from the afternoon. He thought about Dale Hartley, who he had known for 30 years and who had helped him put up that machine shed roof without taking a cent. He thought about June, standing at the field edge in the dark, with a flashlight pointed at the ground. He thought about Travis Burke in the combine cab, learning in real time how to cut lodged wheat in standing water, adapting, figuring it out. He thought about Roy Lester saying, "I underestimated it. Growth was worth something. Even belated growth. Even growth you didn't ask for and didn't particularly need to see." He went inside and made himself supper and watched the county news and went to bed early, because his knees were tired and because there was nothing left to do that day that hadn't been done. Part 10. The county remembers in the spring, at the county soil conservation meeting, a woman named Paulette Rink, who served on the co-op board and had farmed with her husband for 30 years, brought up the story of June Hartley's East Quarter as an example of what she called legacy asset management, which was her professional way of saying old equipment that still works is not wasted money. The discussion that followed was long and genuinely interesting. Several farmers talked about machines they had kept, old planters, old balers, and early model grain vac that had solved problems modern equipment couldn't. One farmer said he had a 1959 Ford tractor he'd kept for exactly one reason. It could get into a gate opening that nothing made after 1975 could fit through, and that gate opening led to the best watering spot on his back pasture. Roy Lester was at the meeting because Harlan County Farm Supply had a seat on the Co-op Advisory Committee. He listened to the discussion without speaking for most of it. Near the end, he said, "What I've been thinking about since last fall is whether our trade and policy adequately accounts for functional value, because I think sometimes we price old equipment on market value and the market value doesn't capture what the machine can actually do." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Paulette Rink said, "That's a pretty remarkable thing to hear from a dealer." "Well," Lester said, "I had a pretty good teacher." He did not look at Norm when he said it, but he did not have to. Epilogue: June Hartley's East Quarter came through the winter well. She planted it to wheat again in October, as she did every year, and by the following spring it was a stand as good as any she had ever grown. The soil rested by the previous year's late harvest and the winter's moisture. The wheat seeds settled into ground that had been given time to recover. She drove past it on a morning in April when the green was just showing, that particular color of early wheat. Not the deep green of summer, but the soft yellow green of something just beginning, and she stopped the truck and got out and looked at it for a while. The field didn't know what it had been through the previous October. It didn't know about the rain, or the lodging, or the 16 loads in the dark, or Norm Schulte's 4020 sitting in 4 inches of water without complaint. It just grew, the way it always grew, according to its own nature and the season's requirements. She thought that was right. She thought that was how it should be. She got back in the truck and drove to town for the parts she needed. The 4020 spent the winter in Norm's shed, under the roof that Dale Hartley had helped build, waiting for the next thing it would be asked to do. Norm checked it every few weeks. Oil level, coolant, tire pressure, the way you check in on something you care about. It always checked out fine. It always checked out fine. If this story found something true in you, the kind of thing you recognize from your own fields or your own family or your own memory of machines that outlasted everyone's expectations, hit that like button and subscribe. Because we have more of these. We have the story of a 1957 Alice Chalmers that got appraised for 40 times what a dealer offered. We have the story of an old hop yard lease that had a clause nobody had read in 30 years. We have a whole country full of old machines and the people who kept them, and the days those decisions turned out to matter. Leave a comment telling us about a piece of equipment you kept when someone told you to let it go, and what happened when you turned out to be right. We'll see you next time. Interlude. The machine shed in winter. There is a particular quality of silence in a machine shed in late October, after the work is done. The harvest smell, diesel and dust and the sweet dry edge of cut wheat settles into the concrete and the wood and stays there through the winter, faint but permanent. Walk into any old farm machine shed in January and you will smell last summer's work, and the summer before that, and the summers going back as far as the shed has stood. Norm Schulte's shed was built in 1987, which meant it had 37 seasons in its walls. The rafters were the original 2x8s, darkened by years of exhaust and humidity. The concrete floor had a long crack along the east wall that he had filled with hydraulic putty twice, and stopped worrying about after the second time. In the northwest corner, where the light came through the little fixed window in the mornings, there was an old wooden workbench with the surface scarred by decades of wrench work and the occasional blade that had slipped. He kept the 4020 in the middle bay. There was room for 3 tractors across in that shed, and in the working years there had been 3. Now the 4020 had the shed mostly to itself, which gave Norm room to work around it and gave the machine a kind of dignity it deserved. He had done the winter prep on it in November. Oil change, coolant check, fuel stabilizer in the tank, air cleaner cleaned out. He had taken the front weights off and hung them on their hook on the wall. He checked the tire pressure and let a little air out of the rear duals, because cold contracts rubber and you want your starting pressure right. He did these things in the same order every year, not because he had to, but because the order was right. The machine had worked hard. It deserved a careful putting away. While he worked, he thought about the East Quarter. He thought about the water coming up over the step plate and the engine holding its note without hesitation. He thought about Travis Burke learning to cut lodged wheat over the course of a single day, starting uncertain and ending confident. He thought about June standing at the field edge with her flashlight. He thought about Dale, who had been a quiet man and a careful farmer and a good neighbor in the way that is common in the county, but still worth naming when you see it. He thought about the machine shed roof, a Saturday in August of 2011, the two of them working in the heat without much conversation because the work didn't require it. Good company doesn't always need words. That was something you learned with time. He put the winter cover on the radiator, a piece of heavy canvas he had cut and hemmed himself, with grommets and rope to tie it snug, and stood back and looked at the machine for a moment. Good work, he said. He said it the way you'd say it to a hand at the end of a long day, simple and direct and meaning it. Then he went inside. The CO Op Board meeting, March, the Harlan County Co-op, held its annual member meeting in the third week of March in the community room at the Fairgrounds building. Paulette Rink, who served on the board as vice chair, had put together a short presentation called Working Inventory. Understanding the hidden value in legacy equipment. She had asked Norm to attend. She had asked June Hartley to attend. Norm sat in the third row with his hat in his lap. June sat 2 seats to his right. Roy Lester was in the back row. Paulette went through the numbers first. The cost of the operation versus what a custom hire at emergency rates would have cost. June had gotten a quote of $9,500 for a wet field custom harvest. The actual cost, Norm's fuel, roughly $140 for 16 loads and the travel. The income recovered, $41,912. The net difference, $51,272 when you counted both the avoided cost and the recovered grain. That's a real number, Paulette said. Not a projection. Not a what if. That's what happened on one farm, on one quarter, in one October. She went on to make a careful argument, backed by figures, that the co-op should consider a legacy equipment registry, a voluntary list of members who had functional older machinery and were willing to be contacted in emergencies. Roy Lester, from the back row, raised his hand. "I'd like to say something," he said. The room turned. "I'm here as a dealer representative, and I recognize that puts a ceiling on how much weight my opinion should carry. But I want to say that I am personally embarrassed that the first phone call June Hartley made about her situation ended with me trying to sell her a $187,000 tractor instead of thinking about what she actually needed." The room was very quiet. "I was wrong about that," he said, "and I'd like to offer our dealership as a resource, service records, knowledge of what equipment is in the county and what it can do. If the board wants that information, we're glad to share it." June Hartley, 2 seats from Norm, did not look at Roy Lester when he said this. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up at the window. Her expression was not triumphant, and it was not forgiving, exactly. It was the expression of a woman who has been through a hard year and is still deciding what to do with what she learned. Norm looked at her. She looked back at him. He gave her the smallest nod. She looked away again and was quiet for the rest of the meeting. The registry. The Harlan County Legacy Equipment Registry launched in June of that year. It had, by the end of its first summer, 23 members. Their machines ranged from a 1952 Farmall M to a 1984 JD 4440 to a collection of old grain wagons that a retired farmer had kept in a tree row for years because he couldn't bring himself to sell them. Norm's 4020 was on the list. The registry was used twice in its first year. Neither use made headlines. That was the point. The value of the registry was in the knowledge itself, the understanding that the county contained resources that the spec sheet world had stopped counting. That knowledge was its own form of insurance, and it cost almost nothing to maintain. Norm signed the sheet at the registry meeting on a Tuesday morning. He went home and checked the oil, out of habit, out of the pleasure of the checking, and stood for a moment in the quiet, with his hand on the warm metal. He had kept this machine because he loved it. He had not known he was keeping it for June Hartley. He had not known he was keeping it for the registry or for Roy Lester's education. He had kept it because it was worth keeping, and the rest had followed from that. That seemed right. That seemed like how most good things worked. If this story found something true in you, the kind of thing you recognize from your own fields or your own family or your own memory of machines that outlasted everyone's expectations, hit that like button and subscribe, because we have more of these. We have the story of a 1957 Alice Chalmers that got appraised for 40 times what a dealer offered. We have the story of an old hopyard lease that had a clause nobody had read in 30 years. We have a whole country full of old machines, and the people who kept them, and the days those decisions turned out to matter. Leave a comment telling us about a piece of equipment you kept when someone told you to let it go, and what happened when you turned out to be right. We'll see you next time.